You've probably seen it, right? It's all over the internet, these videos and posts about men giving up on dating. It seems like it's everywhere, from TikTok to Reddit. So the big question is this just a bunch of online chatter, or is something bigger, something deeper, actually happening in our society? All right, let's really get into it and try to figure out what's going on behind all the noise.
This quote, it just hits, doesn't it? It's from some user on Reddit, and man, it just perfectly nails that feeling of burnout, of total frustration that's really at the core of all this. It's this idea that, you put in all this effort trying to date today, and the reward, it just isn't there. It's such a simple way to say something so complicated, and it's a feeling a lot of people are having, not just guys.
So here's how we're going to tackle this. First, we'll look at how this whole thing blew up online. Then, we'll get into the weeds of digital dating itself. After that, we'll dig into the psychological roots of all this frustration. That'll lead us to the black pill ideology. And finally, we'll have to talk about the serious side, violence, and what we can do about it. All right, first up, the online world. Because, let's be honest, that's where most of us are hearing about this, right? This whole narrative of a dating crisis. It really lives and breathes on social media. It gets amplified there. But what's the reality? What do the stats actually say? For all the talk online about a crisis, the data for a huge chunk of the population tells a totally different story. Get this. According to INSEE, a whopping 7 out of 10 men between 35 and 75 are in a stable relationship. So for them, commitment isn't some impossible dream. It's just life. So if that's true, where is all this frustration and disconnect actually coming from?
Okay, and here's where it all starts to make sense. The picture gets way, way clearer when you zoom in on younger people. This data from Pew Research, and you see it cited everywhere in these online debates, it shows a massive gap. For adults aged 18 to 30, 63% of men say they're single. Compare that to just 34% of women. That's staggering. So here's the key takeaway. This isn't some universal crisis. It's something that's hitting this younger group and hitting them hard. Now, you can't talk about this without talking about the word incel. And it's really important to know where this term actually came from. It was created way back in 1997. And believe it or not, it was just a neutral term. It was for anyone, man or woman, who was involuntarily celibate. It was meant to be a supportive community space, totally different from the dark, hateful meaning it has for so many people today. So who are the people using this label for themselves now? Well, the research gives us a pretty clear picture. We're mostly talking about young, straight guys from all sorts of ethnic backgrounds. But what's really interesting is this kind of perception gap that studies have found. They tend to think that physical attractiveness and money are the most important things to women, while seriously underestimating stuff like intelligence, just being kind, or having a good sense of humor. Okay, that brings us to our next piece of the puzzle. The digital world isn't just a forum where people vent, right? It's an actual environment. It's a space that can shape these feelings and, honestly, often makes them way more intense, especially when we're talking about dating. Check this out. A study from the EU Parliament found a really interesting difference in how men and women generally use social media. Broadly speaking, men are more likely to use it to share opinions, to debate ideas. Women, on the other hand, tend to use it more for maintaining social connections, keeping up with friends and family. Right away, you can see how this fundamental difference could lead to totally different expectations and experiences when they interact online. And of course, there's the big one, dating apps. This is where all that frustration really seems to come to a head. And a lot of these complaints are pretty universal, coming from both men and women. You've got the feeling that it's all about hookups, not real connections. You've got ghosting, which is just awful. The whole thing feels so superficial, just swiping on a picture. Then there's the paradox of choice. Like, there are too many options, so you never actually choose anyone. And on top of all that, you have the algorithms, which some people argue create this 80-20 rule, where the top 20% of men get 80% of the attention. It's a tough environment. Okay, so we've talked about the online world, but why do some people seem to struggle so much more in that environment? What makes a person vulnerable to feeling this way to begin with? To answer that, we have to go deeper. We got to look at the psychological stuff, the things that shape how we connect with people from the very beginning. A huge part of the answer lies in something called attachment theory. It's a massive deal in psychology. Basically, the idea, which comes from a psychologist named John Bowlby, is that our very first relationships, the bonds we form as babies with our parents, create a kind of blueprint. This blueprint shapes how we see and act in relationships for our entire lives. So, researchers broke this down into four main styles. The majority of people, about 62%, are secure. They're generally comfortable with intimacy and feel confident in their relationships. But then you have the other three, which are called insecure styles. You've got avoidant people who are very independent and find it hard to trust others. Then anxious types who are terrified of being rejected and really need a lot of closeness. And finally, disorganized, which is a mix of wanting closeness but also being afraid of it. You can imagine how having one of these insecure styles could make navigating the modern dating world feel almost impossible.
And then you layer societal pressure on top of all that. This quote really gets at it. There's still this persistent idea that men have to be strong, they have to be tough, they can't show vulnerability. This pressure to just bottle everything up makes it incredibly hard for guys to reach out for help, or even just to admit to themselves that they're struggling. It's a huge burden to carry around in silence.
So, what happens when you mix all these ingredients together? You take an insecure attachment style, you add a ton of social pressure, and you throw in the constant frustration of dating apps. What do you get? You get something people are now calling dating burnout. And it's exactly what it sounds like, total emotional exhaustion. After so many disappointments, you just become cynical, tired, your self-confidence is shot, and the thought of even trying to go on another date feels completely draining. But for some people, that burnout, that feeling of hopelessness, it doesn't just go away. It calcifies. It hardens into something much more rigid, a full-blown ideology. It becomes a whole worldview that explains their pain, but in a very dark and fatalistic way. And that ideology is known as the black pill. Think of it as the most extreme, cynical endpoint of all the dating frustration we've talked about. The central belief is that your fate is already decided. It's determined by things you can't change, your genetics, your looks, a society that's rigged against you. And if that's true, the thinking goes, then what's the point? The only rational response is to just give up entirely. They even have an acronym for it, LDAR, which stands for Lay Down and Rot.
At its core, this whole ideology is built on a psychological concept called an external locus of control. It's a fancy way of saying you believe you have zero control over your own life, that everything that happens to you is because of outside forces. And this is a really powerful mindset because it allows you to shift all the blame for your own misery onto other people, onto women, onto so-called attractive men, onto society itself. And that shift is what can breed some really deep and dangerous resentment.
And that resentment, that's what brings us to our last section, and frankly, the most serious part of this whole topic. Because when that resentment boils over from the online world into the real world, the consequences can be absolutely devastating. So let's talk about the violence that has been linked to this ideology and what's being done to try and stop it. And this isn't some brand new thing. You can trace its roots back. The 1989 massacre in Montreal, where a gunman targeted and murdered 14 women, has become a sort of twisted touchstone for this community. And then starting around 2014, we began to see a series of horrific acts of mass violence in the US and Canada that were explicitly connected to this ideology. It's gotten to the point where counter-extremism agencies now monitor these communities as a serious threat. An EU report actually breaks the violence down into 3 levels. First, there's violence directed inward, at the personal level. This is self-destructive stuff, suicidal thoughts, that whole lay down and rot idea. Second, there's interpersonal violence. This is things like online harassment or something called chadfishing, where they'll create a fake profile of an attractive guy to trick women just to turn around and humiliate them. And the third and most terrifying level is societal. We're talking about mass shootings and other attacks on the public, very often specifically targeting women. So what's the solution? Well, experts say there's no single answer. It has to be a whole range of things. Educating young people about digital media and healthy sexuality, training the professionals who are on the front lines, like therapists and teachers, and a huge one, we have to fight the stigma around men's mental health. It's also about showing that there are other healthier ways to be a man. But the trickiest part of all, it's this incredibly delicate balancing act. You have to recognize that the loneliness and pain these guys are feeling is genuine, without ever validating the hateful ideology that can grow out of it. And so all of this leaves us with one last really big question to think about. When you look at all these pieces, the loneliness, the frustration with technology, this breakdown in how we talk to each other, it all points to a massive paradox, doesn't it? We live in this hyper-connected world. We have more ways to reach each other than at any point in history. But are we actually losing our ability to truly connect? Are we forgetting how to build those real empathetic bonds that every single one of us needs to not just survive, but to actually thrive?